Miigwech. Miigwech means thank you in Ojibwe. So miigwech for being here with all of us today. Now, I'd like to take a moment and ask all of you to look around this room. I know it's dark, but just look around, look at the people next to you. Now, try to remember the door you came in, and before that, the chilly path that you entered the building with. Now, try harder. Try to imagine this area hundreds of years ago, before there were phones or computers or big glass buildings. I know it's likely impossible, so let me paint a picture. This very spot was the traditional home of Indigenous communities like the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit River. Then, as now, they had laws and government, economies, and trade. Their sacred traditions, including art and ceremonies and stories, connected them to each other and to this land. I believe that all of us at UTSC should be part of acknowledging our Indigenous history, but not just as a history, as a present and as a future. We all have a responsibility to take action, and that is what I am here to talk to you about today. Today, I'd like to take you on a journey. It's a journey that I think is so important. It's to try to understand what it means as non-Indigenous people, how to acknowledge colonialism towards Indigenous people, and how to build better relationships. And I want you to join me on this quest. Now, I had the unusual privilege of growing up in Canada's north, getting to do really cool things like ride skidoos and have lots of snow days, and one time even sleep in an igloo. But of all the memories I have, there's one that stands out especially vividly. I'm going to take you back there. So it was May 1993, almost 25 years ago. My friends and I shuffled into the weathered gym of our high school in Iqaluit, sitting on the uncomfortable wooden bleachers of Inukshuk High School. We joked with each other as we slowly made our way into the room, getting shushed, as always, by our frustrated teachers. But on that particular day, instead of watching a soccer game like we normally would, we were going to watch the Prime Minister of Canada sign the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement with Inuit leaders. This document, signed next to the rickety basketball hoop, created Nunavut, which means our land. Nunavut became Canada's third territory and a self-governing area for the Inuit of the Eastern Arctic. Now, the land that I stood on then, as you can see, was really different from the land that we're on right now. In the summertime, the land was dotted with wild, beautiful flowers. And in the wintertime, there were unimaginably high slopes of snow. But that land, Nunavut, would be led by those whose ancestors had lived there for thousands of years. Inuit could govern their land and their people themselves. Now, seeing that law signed, it made a big difference to a lot of us in high school. We were quiet, maybe for the first time ever. But for me, seeing that, it profoundly changed how I saw the world. Now, as a lawyer and as a professor, my passion is governance. Who gets to decide what happens in cities? I teach city politics and decision-making. And in my classes, you'll learn all about councillors and budgets and elections. But you'll also learn about treaties and about laws. And you'll learn this through texts that are written by Indigenous authors, and you'll even learn this from Indigenous people themselves. Because urban governance very rarely includes talk about First Nations people, the First Nations people that had governments here first. And that really bugs me because I know that so much of the story is missing. So here's some of the things that you would learn in my class. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because, you know, we want to keep it light. But one of the things you would learn is that Canadian cities are, in fact, where they are because of the Indigenous communities that were here first. So the Credit, Don, and Humber rivers attracted people here because of the rich salmon fisheries. And the Rouge and the Humber in particular were really important for trade. This trade and economic activity led to settlements and people and families long before Europeans and then other people came. Now, in most textbooks about urban government, very little is ever said about this early origin of cities. But names like Toronto and Spadina and Mississauga and Ontario all come from this legacy. And there are other names too. This is a slide from Ogima Makana, an organization that you should all look up that is doing really cool things to reclaim Indigenous names and history on city spaces like billboards and street signs right here in Toronto. In fact, you would see some of these signs right now downtown. So Indigenous stories are so often missing, but I am committed to looking. And today and in the future, I'm asking you to start looking for the missing stories in your own experiences, in the places that you inhabit every day. And you can start right here, right now, here at UTSC. So to acknowledge means to be curious and open to challenging what we think we know. I think there are three kinds of acknowledging that we can do. We can acknowledge history. We can connect learning to Aki, which means land, in Ojibwe. And we can nurture respectful and reciprocal relationships. So we all need to reconcile ourselves to an important truth. And the truth is that there's a long legacy of colonialism that affects how we think of Indigenous people. One effect of this colonialism is on the laws that we are taught. When Europeans came to Canada, they met Indigenous people with governments and laws and land who'd been here for hundreds or thousands of years in some cases. This land that we're on was already subject to an agreement, to a trade agreement, long negotiated, long sorted out. It was called the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. And this agreement was to share the land peacefully. Now, Europeans knew that Indigenous people were here, and this was reflected in many of the laws that came afterwards, including the Royal Proclamation. New treaties were created between these governments and First Nations, and they were created to share the land and the resources that were here. But settlers, they didn't really know what it meant to share, and they didn't follow the laws that they had agreed to. So for example, UTSC rests on top of the Williams Treaty. This is an agreement that was signed between First Nations and the Canadian government about power relating to a huge area of land. It is as meaningful as the Canadian Constitution, but very few of us ever hear about it. UTSC's website, which you'll see on the screen behind you, doesn't even mention this treaty. So treaties and relationships with colonial powers have deeply affected Indigenous communities. Government decisions have meant that Indigenous people have lost a lot. Children have been sent to residential schools and families have been torn apart. Indigenous people have lost their right to fish and to hunt and to access land that was never given away. First Nations have had to spend a lot of money trying to force the Canadian government follow the laws that they had agreed to. Now, acknowledging this is really hard for some people. It's hard for many people. Some think that it was only our ancestors who were part of this, not us. Others of us think that we are here too recently for this history to be meaningful to us and that we can't possibly be to blame. Now, I have a former student who could tell you a lot about this. She's a first-generation young woman from Ethiopia. And in one of my classes, she studied the City of Toronto's urban Aboriginal strategy. And through this project, she interviewed a lot of Indigenous leaders. And this student had always thought of herself at the proverbial bottom. And what she realized by doing this project is how much privilege she had as a university student, as a newcomer. And that was amazing to see. It was amazing to see her absorb those lessons so thoroughly and so honestly, and she's now gone on to do a lot more work relating to reconciliation. But this is the first and the hardest part of acknowledging. And all of us here at UTSC have a great opportunity. We have Elder Wendy Phillips, who's helping to guide the university along the path of reconciliation. She's teaching us tons of things that most of us have no idea about. But we all have to take responsibility ourselves. We all need to become aware, to question what we are told is the whole story. This is a first kind of acknowledging, to see with open eyes what is right in front of us. This is a map of the Greater Toronto Area showing the treaties that form part of this area. Where is your home, your family, your work? Which treaty are you part of? A second acknowledgement is about the land, called Aki in Ojibwe. To many Indigenous communities, the way that we understand ownership is a deeply flawed and problematic idea. There is no single owner that takes control of space against all others. Instead, Aki, the land below us and above us, is meant to be taken care of for future generations and for all beings. Now, as a non-Indigenous person, I'm trying to shift how I see and think and feel by paying attention to the land. We're so blessed here at UTSC to be part of this gorgeous area, but how often do we ever think about it? So let's imagine the land as a core part of our learning. This isn't easy. Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs says that the idea that law can be learned from reading the land is hard. It requires practice. It's a literacy that is very often not taught in schools. For example, in my own department of city studies, we could transform city planning by doing it alongside Indigenous communities. What would cities look like if they were co-developed and co-managed together? Our campus here could have Indigenous languages on all of our buildings. Can you imagine what that would mean if every day we were absorbing this connection to the land and to our Indigenous history? And at minimum, we could show the Indigenous history of this space on our website. It's an easy thing to do. I believe that connecting to the land will change how we think. And I hope it leads us to truly sharing the land with Indigenous people as our treaties, as our laws said that we should. As a third way of acknowledging, let's think about relationships. Universities are fundamentally about people. So every year at the conclusion of my classes, my students write an evaluation for me, and every single year they say that the best part of the whole class was each other, was learning what their fellow students had to say. Now, I try really hard not to take this personally, but I agree. Because at the end of the day, it's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said too. They said that education is the key to reconciliation, but only a true and complete experience can build the relationships that we need to have respectful and peaceful coexistence between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. Relationships were meant to be at the core of treaties. The intention was to connect Indigenous and non-Indigenous people within a nation-to-nation relationship. So let's think of Indigenous people not as a news report or an archaeological relic or a cartoon character or a character at all. Indigenous people are our classmates, our teachers, our colleagues, they're our friends. So for all of us here, this means noticing when Indigenous knowledge and perspectives are missing. So here's some of the ways that you can acknowledge. You can read and listen to the many Indigenous writers, poets, and academics like Hayden King and Lee Miracle and Leanne Simpson. You can connect with UTSC's elder Wendy Phillips and join her at the many ceremonies and events that are taking place right here. If you don't know of it, you can download the First Story app, which gives you guided tours throughout the city so that you can connect better with the Indigenous history and present of our city. You can read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. It's available online. Just download it and read it. It's really important. And you can also ask why there aren't more Indigenous professors that are teaching your classes. So I want to leave you with two final points. First of all, Canada's history and story cannot be taught in a one-sided way. None of our laws are meaningful if certain ones are ignored. This is a basic fabric of democracy. So all of us have to do something, and that something is to learn the whole story. Second, way more room has to be created for Indigenous voices to be heard at UTSC and elsewhere. The Indigenous history of cities shouldn't really be taught by me. It should be taught with someone who knows more. It should be taught with someone with an Indigenous background. So this is all just a start to acknowledging our Indigenous history. But I know that we can do it. And I want you to join me. Miigwech.